understanding the legal landscape. Not dealing with governance simply isn't an option.
Hello everyone! In our previous lectures, we explored blockchain governance from a theoretical perspective, following its evolution over time. Today, we will look at the practical challenges that arise in blockchain governance. We will look at the what, where, who, and how to govern. From the spectrum between immutability and adaptability to the ongoing debate between on-chain and off-chain governance, we will examine the choices that blockchain ecosystems face. We will also address the crucial role of participants and the culture that shapes long-term alignment and trust in governance systems. This lecture will throw up more questions than it gives answers. It's on all of us to find the answers we're looking for. By the end of this lecture, you will have a clearer understanding of the trade-offs involved in governance design, the challenges of maintaining accountability in decentralized systems, and the strategies for fostering active participation. We will also explore how to navigate power politics and regulatory pressure while ensuring that governance structures remain open to change and growth. Code is law. Whatever the code in a blockchain says is happening is what is happening. That was the mantra of the early Bitcoin days. The problem is the world isn't as easy. Not even the Bitcoin protocol is immutable. It has been upgraded several times over the years. Code, configuration, and even state have to change sometimes. So while it is desirable for Bitcoin to change as little as possible, more complex DeFi protocols like collateralized algorithmic stablecoins might want to define which assets are allowed as collateral and under what risk parameters. These changes are based on human decisions and they need governance. So depending on the application, we want to have complete immutability or a lot of mutability. Let's call this the mutability spectrum. Our trade-off is, the more immutable a system is, the more the user can trust that it will always behave as expected. The more mutable a system is, the better it is able to react to changing circumstances and evolving situations. So consider which code components should stay immutable, what might change in the future, and which system parameters might have to be modified. Typically, we want to have some degree of mutability for the application while having immutability of state, so that users maintain sovereignty over what belongs to them. This is the what to govern. Let's look at the where to govern. Blockchain governance consists of two separate but strongly interacting fields: on-chain governance and off-chain governance. On-chain governance covers the processes that are embedded directly into the blockchain, where decisions are automatically executed. Off-chain governance, on the other hand, is about how stakeholders negotiate decisions in the social space. Networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum rely exclusively on off-chain governance, where developers, node operators, and other stakeholders negotiate protocol upgrades and no further facilities are available. In contrast, more modern platforms like Polkadot employ components of on-chain governance, where protocol upgrades, configuration changes, and even the usage of the treasury are decided via voting on-chain. On-chain mechanics can reduce bureaucracy and operational complexity. They provide us with a richer toolset of options to choose from when doing governance. But it's important to understand that as long as humans are involved, off-chain governance will always be part of the equation. Discussions and negotiations happen in the social space. Typical risks with off-chain governance are a lack of transparency of formal processes, concentrating power among a small group, a lack of accountability, and even limiting the involvement of the broader community. This lack of clear formal procedures can cause delays or deadlock in pushing for decisions, especially when key stakeholders disagree. Who should govern a network? Is it the nodes producing blocks? Is it the token holders, the developers, the active users of the community, or everyone? In the real world, it is likely going to be a combination of all of those options. We can differentiate between who makes the rules, the legislative branch, and who executes them, the executive branch. For the legislative branch, we want the relevant stakeholders that are part of the system to come to good decisions together. So our key question here is, how can we build the right negotiation process? For the executive branch, we want to have efficient teams and structures that remain focused on the mission and manage to deliver the results we want to have. Finding the right structures and processes is the main challenge here. And there might even be a judicial branch. We want to make sure that accountability in this system is maintained. How can we audit operations and make sure that money is managed properly? And that executive bodies remain aligned with the stakeholder intentions. Another practical problem is regulatory overreach. Regulatory entities might want to impose rules on the system that violate the core principles of the network, such as the sovereignty of users and immutability of state. Networks might be challenged with requests to identify users or forcefully transfer assets. Recently, there were regulatory actions against Tornado Cash, a privacy-preserving mixer on Ethereum. These actions against privacy-centric technologies show that governments are increasingly willing to intervene in protocols that they think violate laws. Additionally, legal uncertainties exist around the question of liability in blockchain governance. If a DAO makes a decision that a person wants to challenge in a court, who is held responsible? Since DAOs operate without centralized controls, it can be difficult to assign liability in legal disputes. Governance is how we change the system. Governance is when stakeholders negotiate to come to agreements. We could say the goal is to keep the peace. If stakeholders remain aligned on the overall goals, they remain part of the system. The basic alignment problem here is that individual actors are often of different opinions, either out of practical reasons or because they have different ideologies. So a practical difference might be a disagreement on how much money should be spent on a new tool. An example of an ideological disagreement is when stakeholders are conservative or aggressive in spending. Conservatives might want to only support sophisticated plans, while on the other hand, aggressive spenders want to support projects with good upside but uncertain outcomes. No single party is right. They just have different ideologies. So how can we negotiate such situations? If we cannot find solutions, community members will leave the system and go different paths, potentially even forking out the application or chain. Ideally, we find ways to resolve conflicts fast in a manner that is agreeable for everyone and potentially even on-chain. This way, polarization can be avoided and we can create more trust. And trust is the credit that is the hardest to earn in trustless environments. So how do we handle disagreements and how do we create processes that we can trust? Negotiations should also not just be focused on reaching a consensus on a single decision, but ideally have a grand strategy in mind that focuses on overcoming the main challenges of the network, cover high-level programs to address them, and span over a long amount of time. How can we create big strategies? How do we create long-term alignment? Power politics also play a big role. Some parties might bribe or extort others to gain more decision-making power in the system. How do we make governance resilient against dynamics where a single individual or a small group tries to monopolize power to achieve their goals? Governance lives from participation. For a person to be able to participate, they need to have time and motivation. They also need to be educated enough to understand the decisions in question, and they need to have the necessary information to make an informed decision. All of these are scarce resources. How can we help people who have little available time, money, resources to participate? How can we lower the barriers and reduce information asymmetries? A typical issue for a new participant is the lack of experience. How can we get those people onboarded? And participants who have shown to be valuable, who have developed deep ties to the network, typically see an increased demand to give their attention. For some, even to the extent that they burn out or grow disenfranchised. So how can we avoid participant exhaustion and burnout? Quite often, decisions face low voter turnout, which can reduce the perceived legitimacy of a decision. It can also make those decisions vulnerable to a constant re-evaluation by the opposing parties. Lastly, many of the previous arguments point to a common theme: culture. Developing the right culture in participants is what helps onboard them, grow them, and develop them into active agents. This involves educating participants on the values, philosophy, the history, and technology of an ecosystem. How do we distribute organizational and cultural knowledge? How do we develop the overall organization? As governance matures, its members gather a lot of knowledge on how to best approach operational questions. How do we establish a culture of sharing those best practices? Governance participants also need to grow a thick skin. Conflicts and infighting can eat into the motivation of participants, leading them to quit. The best antidote is a culture that develops an understanding of consensus building and long-term alignment. How can we develop a culture that is constructive, that is optimistic, and that is fair? Governance structures help execute stakeholder intent, but often do this by centralizing certain responsibilities. A typical worry is that those structures become too stable and resistant to change, while no longer providing the value that they initially did. How can we ensure that structures stay open to change, and how do we find the right balance between centralization and decentralization? So let's summarize. It's becoming obvious now that blockchain governance is one of the most complex and important aspects of decentralized systems. Balancing immutability and flexibility and designing a system that involves the right stakeholders and gets them educated, motivated, and encouraged to participate long-term are big challenges that we must address. However, these challenges also inspire us to grow. When we develop a culture of collaboration and trust, we can build governance systems that are both resilient and adaptable, and we open the doors for a future where we can take matters into our own hands again. Polkadot OpenGov. OpenGov is a fascinating example of on-chain governance that stands apart from traditional models like those seen in Bitcoin or Ethereum. Polkadot's approach involves a more holistic and meritocratic, community-driven process that encompasses not just protocol upgrades, but a wide range of governance issues, from strategic to operational decisions. So what is OpenGov? In essence, OpenGov is Polkadot's system of universal token holder governance. That means that everyone can submit any kind of proposal, whether it changes the inflation of how the system works or how to spend money. It also means that every decision is made on-chain and every token holder can participate. Decisions about the network, such as protocol changes, changing parameters, deploying treasury funds, they're all made through on-chain proposals and voted on by all the token holders. This makes the system inclusive but also complex. It's essentially a free marketplace of ideas, and this puts the burden to make the right decisions on the token holders. So how does it work? In OpenGov, we have two kinds of proposals. Automatically executing decisions such as protocol upgrades or treasury spends on one side. On the other side, we have signal voting, where we gather stakeholders' sentiment on a topic. In both cases, the process is the same. First, a proposal is submitted on-chain. Second, to avoid spam on the network, a decision deposit needs to be placed. Then third, the community of token holders debates it, and they will vote and make a decision. And then at the end of a defined period, we count all the votes, and we will have a result. In OpenGov, voting power is directly tied to token ownership. Each free token in your account can be used for voting, even while you're staking. The tokens can be used to vote on multiple referenda in parallel. Participants can also increase their voting power through conviction voting. Conviction voting allows you to lock up your tokens from 7 to 224 days to increase the weight of your tokens. This means that if you intend to hold tokens for a longer time, you will also have more weight in the decisions of the network. And there is also a mechanism of delegation. So users can delegate their voting power to other users. And this allows people who don't have the time or the capacity to vote in OpenGov to still make their voices heard through someone who represents them.
There's been a lot of improvements to the technology in terms of scalability. I'd say like this is one big thing. The second big thing is the level of decentralization. So a big change obviously is the governance mechanism for Polkadot. When the network first launched, we had a super user account that could control everything, and that was eventually given up. But there was still a technical committee, there was still an elected council that had very limited powers, but they did have some extra powers. Then with the launch of OpenGov, what we've seen is a move towards this more of a platonic ideal of one dot, one vote. If you have DOT in your account, you are directing the future of the network. All decisions on the network, every change that is made only can be done through the agreement of the DOT holders. You're in charge of the treasury, right? Of providing funding to different projects that are helping to build the ecosystem. So not just like, boring, dry, technical changes, but also, hey, I would like, funds that are in the on-chain DOT treasury to be used for this project or that project or this other project, or to tip somebody who did something cool, or to provide a bounty for some problem that we're seeing in the ecosystem. Web3 Foundation has really worked to ensure that more people in governance get a voice and not just a single group of people. And it's continuing to do this. We're continuing to try to decentralize in all kinds of different ways.
So let's talk about voting tracks. OpenGov consists of multiple proposal tracks, which categorize decisions based on their nature. There are different tracks for spending, runtime upgrades, administrative tasks, etc. This allows us to make a difference between proposals depending on how impactful they are. If, for example, a proposal just consists of a small tip for a community member, maybe they have created a helpful dashboard, the decision deposit can be very low and it can be approved quickly. If a proposal is very expensive or it can have very far-reaching consequences, it requires a high decision deposit and it will also be in voting for a long period. This ensures that we have less spam on the network, get to small decisions fast, and have sufficient time for impactful decisions. For example, small tips are typically approved in 3 to 7 days, while big spends, parameter changes, and signal voting take up to 35 days. Having different tracks also allows people to only focus on the tracks that they have expertise in, and it allows the system to have proper security barriers by limiting special privileges to certain tracks. Each track considers 2 parameters to determine when a decision is made: support and approval. Support counts how many tokens of all the tokens in existence are voting on this proposal. It is a measure of voter turnout. Important decisions need to have a higher voter turnout. Approval compares how many aye versus nay votes there are cast on this proposal. Okay, now let's talk about the most famous aspect of OpenGov, the treasury. The treasury allows the network to allocate funds to various projects and initiatives. The treasury's primary income is coming from inflation, and it can use those funds for initiatives that are intended to benefit the whole ecosystem. Since it is such a novel way to fund projects, many different parties apply for funding, and we have developed multiple different mechanisms to provide that funding. The most classical form is direct spending, but funds can also be spent after a certain time. So this creates the opportunity to schedule monthly payments. Funds can also be given to executive bodies. Funds can also be opportunity to schedule monthly payments. And after a certain also direct to provide that funding. The most classical form is direct spending, but funds can also be spent after a certain time. So this creates the opportunity to schedule monthly payments. Funds can also be given to executive bodies for them to be managed according to a certain mandate, and we will talk about that in a second. The treasury is also multi-asset and multi-chain. So multi-asset means that it not only holds DOT, but also stablecoins like USDT and USDC. Recently, the treasury even held some MIF tokens. They were acquired in a strategic token swap with the intention to distribute them to DOT holders. The treasury is also multi-chain, which means that it is not only represented on the core Polkadot system chains, but also currently holds 25% of its funds on parachains, such as Hydration, Centrifuge, Bifrost, and Pendulum. And as of the time of this recording, which is October 2024, $10 million are also deployed in market operations in DeFi. While we're talking about numbers, we just finished the latest treasury report and the numbers are in. So Polkadot has a balance of $150 million, or about $33 million equivalent. The future inflation is expected to bring in about $18 million per year. And the treasury is currently on track to spend about $23 million per year. So this shows that while the treasury still has reserves to last for the upcoming years, it is important for OpenGov to develop a sustainable way to budget its resources. Polkadot aims to become a fully decentralized organization, where every aspect of the organization is directed by OpenGov. Similar to how companies have departments and governments have ministries, OpenGov can have departments for all the essential goals, like technology development, marketing, operations, education, and so on. So once there is a department for every essential function, we can simplify the question of budgeting to which department should receive how much of the available budget. So the crucial difference is that blockchain governance can be decentralized in ways that traditional organizations can't. For example, we can be less accepting of mediocre central planning and much rather focus on project-based budgeting. The problem with central planning is that nobody knows which master plan is the best and how we can arrive at the best concept. Instead, we can focus on agents suggesting projects and stakeholders agreeing to support them. The projects that receive the most support are, logically, the ones that stakeholders believe have the highest chance of positively impacting the network. Executive bodies are how OpenGov implements its decisions. They are like sub-DAOs. Remember that the legislative branch covers what we want to do, and now the executive branch gives the answer to how we get it done. In OpenGov, there are currently 2 types of executive bodies. Bounties are a mechanism where the treasury can dedicate funds to achieve certain outcomes. It's essentially a multisig with a team of curators that can vote according to a social contract. The curators take care of managing the bounty and making sure that results are achieved. And what we see is that OpenGov is now developing a rich culture of best practices around those bounties, and they are becoming increasingly important as kind of departments of Polkadot governance. Now we also have collectives. Collectives are similar to bounties, but with the additional benefit that they have dedicated code that defines how they work. The Polkadot Technical Fellowship was the first collective, and it is a collective of the core developers of Polkadot. Because this collective is embedded into the core of Polkadot, it can have special features, like its own subtreasury, different member ranks with different salaries, and the power to fast-track certain proposals on OpenGov. OpenGov has developed an engaged community around the whole governance process. On the YouTube channel of the Kusumarian, we have a weekly discussion where proposals are presented and discussed. And on my X channel, Edison Bob, we host a weekly space called OpenGov Office Hours. It's an open mic format where we give community members the opportunity to speak up, to ask questions, and to pitch their own ideas. And the Web3 Foundation has made its own contribution to a more engaged and democratic community. They have launched the Decentralized Voices program. It allows individuals and communities in Polkadot to apply and become a decentralized voice. And this way, they receive a substantial delegation and voting power. So now their role is to engage with the community members, ask critical questions on proposals, and negotiate a better deal for OpenGov that represents the wider interest of the community. The Decentralized Voices program is a rotating program, so it ensures that power doesn't get locked into a limited number of parties. Lastly, I would like to talk a little bit about how Polkadot is beginning to develop its first aspects of constitution. So we just talked about signal voting, but what is it good for? Signal voting helps us understand stakeholder preferences, and it is a tool to allow stakeholders to reach alignment, a soft consensus about the future of the direction of the network. You can think of it this way. There are many modern democracies where two or more parties are forming a government together. To get it done, they write a coalition agreement that sets out their common goals for the next few years. While it is not guaranteed that they will achieve their goals, it still gives everyone a reasonable expectation of what is going to happen. So this is what we mean by soft consensus. It allows us to reduce uncertainty so that everyone can direct their work and their attention in the same general direction. And signal voting gives us a mechanism to agree on a direction by, for example, comparing different options. Just recently, Polkadot stakeholders agreed to lower inflation. How? They voted on 3 different inflation proposals. This way, after a long debate, the 3 most popular options were compared through hard token voting, and a single option turned out to be the most popular. So this now gives developers and community members more certainty, and they can prepare the changes to the network to implement this new model. Soft consensus gives us clarity on how we can work together. And if for some reason circumstances change, we are free to quickly adapt to the new situation without being locked into a potentially outdated strategy. In the end, what counts for users of the network is reliability and predictability. We want to trust that what the network says today is also true tomorrow. And the bigger the network as the ecosystem grows, and the more relevant it gets, the more reliable it also needs to become. We can see this overall process as the first step towards legislation and blockchain constitutionalism. So to summarize, Polkadot OpenGov is just at the start of its journey. We are very often at the leading edge of innovation. We're discovering how we can onboard hundreds or even thousands of people into governance so that they can participate at the same time. We are developing decentralized strategies, and we are finding ways to negotiate budgets. I think that if a blockchain is serious about decentralization, it has to put all of its essential functions into the hands of the community. And this is what excites me about OpenGov. Together, we are paving the way for the future of blockchain governance.
I have noticed in your matches that Kixon is usually the one deciding the strategies. How does that make you feel, Tessis?
Well, he's the in-game leader.
Polkadot has open governance. That means that everyone gets to decide. I think our CS team should have that too.
In Polkadot, we don't believe in having one leader. It's all about community. Like, for example, when you're playing on Mirage, and Kixon over here says, go A, do you sometimes want to go B?
No.
I know it's difficult for you to speak your mind when you have Kixon over here always bossing you around.
Look, I call the shots because it makes the communication more clear.
And
Less chaos.
And communication is important, but it's called OpenGov, not Kixon.gov. Am I right, Tessis? What if at the start of every round, we have a meeting where everyone can share what they feel the strategy should be like?
I just want to keep the things the way they are.
Okay, who wants to keep everything exactly the way it is? Guys, we just made a decision together. Come on, let's hear it for community. Mwah. Mwah.
I think we just had our first AAG.
Polkadot is one of the largest DAOs out there, which has advanced on-chain governance features. To participate in Polkadot OpenGov, you just need to have DOT on your wallet account. Let me show you a glimpse of Polkadot OpenGov and the tools available to participate in it. If you use Nova Wallet on your mobile, then do check out the governance interface. They also implement SwipeGo, which is pretty cool. If you have your accounts on the browser extension wallets, then you can use either Polkassembly or Subsquare, which expose a lot of Polkadot OpenGov features for you. Alright, I'm on Polkassembly right now. Here I have the list of referenda across like multiple tracks. I'm able to choose any of these referenda, click on one of those, and I'm able to vote on it, either aye or nay or abstain, or even split my vote in percentage. While voting, you can also select conviction. If I choose the maximum conviction of 6 times and vote aye, this way I can multiply my voting power by 6 times, and if the referendum passes, then the dot I use for voting is locked away for 224 days. Now, let us look at the different tracks available. You can see that there are numerous tracks that deal with referenda that can access the funding from the Polkadot Treasury. Polkadot Treasury predominantly holds DOT as its asset, but is also capable of holding other assets like USDC and USDT. Different tracks have different spend limits. For instance, the Treasurer track is capable of spending up to 10 million DOT, and the small tipper track is capped at 250 DOT. As you may have guessed, the safeguards for Treasury track should be higher than the small tipper track, given the high stakes. For the small tipper track, the approval and support curves drop pretty steeply. Let me help you interpret these approval and support curves and their implications right away. For the small paper track, at the 90th hour, which is like the end of the 4th day after the referendum enters decision period, it only requires 1% of the total dot issuance to vote on it, and at least 80% of I votes are required from that 1%. As days progress, like after a week, it only requires 0.25% of support and 51% of ayes. Hence, it is likely a small paper track referendum gets approved within 10 days or so. But if you look at the treasurer track, it requires 40% of dot issuance to show up and vote at the 90th hour, and only at the 650th hour, which is around 27 days, this gets relaxed and only one person needs to show up as support. And at least 51% of those need to vote aye, showing their approval. This ensures that the majority of Polkadot community has enough time to deliberate on this referendum that is asking for a significant amount of funds through the treasurer track. Alright, now you can vote on multiple referenda on multiple tracks with the same dot that you've used to vote on referenda earlier. If you're a busy person and do not have the time to go over the referendum to make an informed decision, Polkadot OpenGov allows you to delegate your voting power with conviction to someone who you trust to do their job well. There are multiple dashboards where you can find the list of delegates. Web3 Foundation delegates its voting power to the community members through the Decentralized Voices program, which recently picked its delegates for the cohort number 3. I've only touched the tip of the iceberg of the features Polkadot OpenGov has to offer. I encourage you to explore more on Polkadot OpenGov and take active part in Polkadot governance.
So when it comes to blockchain governance, there's a fun story actually how I became involved, and that was really me in 2016, 17, starting to argue with a lot of Bitcoin people who kept telling me and indoctrinating me of like there can only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. And just for being, the devil's advocate, I kept saying like I bet we can change that if we really wanted to. And then of course, coming out of that argument, I had to go and figure out how could we possibly change the hard-coded limit of 21 million Bitcoin. And what that led me to was governance. So sort of understanding that really if we all wanted to, and if there was a process and structures that supported that process, there is a way of changing immutable protocols. And that was sort of my first entry point. But then what I found really interesting going deeper into it was maybe figuring out that a lot of the technical protocols and infrastructures that I interact with on a day-to-day, like Instagram or Telegram or Twitter, I don't get asked my opinion of how I would like things to work. So I don't get asked if my data should be passed on to third parties. I don't get asked if an algorithm should, support, in my opinion, a problematic Elon Musk version of freedom of speech, for example, on X. Whereas I would like to be asked. And the fascinating thing really with blockchains is tools and infrastructures that I interact with on a day-to-day, like Instagram or Telegram or Twitter, I don't get asked my opinion of how I would like things to work. So I don't get asked if my data should be passed on to third parties. I don't get asked if an algorithm should, support, in my opinion, a problematic Elon Musk version of freedom of speech, for example, on X, whereas I would like to be asked. And the fascinating thing really with blockchains is that we don't have that default of going back to just asking a central operating company of how this technology should behave. Landscape of governance is really wide open. So thinking about how to govern blockchain projects, I think, can also teach us a lot about how to improve in how we govern other non-blockchain based technical infrastructures, which I think is very, very much needed. I think one of the big things, especially when we're talking about the nation state example, that has come up numerous times. There's also been experiments. I don't recall the exact country, but there's been countries that have experimented with blockchain-based voting in their elections, things like that. I think one of the big things that we are oversimplifying here is that the problems that we see in nation-state governance and governments are not simply due to a lack of better tools, right? They go very deep and they're very human, and they have evolved over many, many years and are very particular to a specific context and culture. And in my opinion, saying the blockchain will fix this is like slapping a band-aid on something that needs more of a long-term holistic healthcare plan to be solved. And that's just something that I think would be very naive. There are areas, in my opinion, where maybe learning from blockchain governance makes more sense than in the nation-state example. So for me, that's very far-fetched, or that's still a long way to go. It's interesting to think about open source projects in general. Open source, if you look at your phone, if it's an Android, even if it's an iOS, 70% of the software in those things are built by open source communities based on open source projects, etc. So open source software is really this critical infrastructure in our world today. Therefore, it's really crucial to have good governance practices around these projects. Because if something goes wrong, or if somebody is able, and a malicious actor is able, to co-opt these things, then it really has vast consequences across the global economy and also for individuals and companies and whatnot. So in open source projects and communities, I think there is an interesting aspect of learning from some of the governance innovations and experiments that we've seen in the blockchain space, which of course is also part or a subset of open source. However, here I know there's also a big concern from the open source community around the adoption of tokens and these more financialized sort of governance primitives in their communities. And I personally very much hear this concern, because whenever you do introduce something like a token, something that does have financial value in and of itself, you also introduce an incentive not just to behave well, but for people to come in and mess up that system just for the token. So the governance itself, by being token-based, sort of becomes the problem, rather than fixing a problem of having more structured and automated processes in an open source project. So I think there is an ambivalence around using token-based governance forms. Recording outcomes, or logging certain comments of a software, etc. in the blockchain, I think those are other things that we can maybe think about that could be useful.
In a permissionless world, in a decentralized world where we're not interacting here in real life, it's harder to establish accountability. And this is something that we're seeing in our governance system right now. People are also working on solutions there. But I think it's a property of digital interactions in general, not just Polkadot's governance per se. I think we all are somewhat familiar with this analogy that in person, you and I interact differently than we do over Twitter. And sometimes we exhibit different behaviors, and sometimes, unfortunately, worse when we're doing interactions over the online world, because that essence of being in person is not present. So I think this is something that is to some extent plaguing all digital governance systems, including Polkadot. But I'm happy that Polkadot is not, it's not like scared of this phenomenon and saying, okay, oh no, we're actually going to let one company rule the show, or like, this is too difficult, let's not just do it. Experimenting with these difficult forms of digital governance is part of the essence of Web3, and I'm very happy to see that Polkadot is bravely trying it, no matter the difficulties. Second is also that we are stuck, not just Polkadot, I think the entire Web3 space, with the idea of one token, one vote, which is good, but I think we all acknowledge at some level that it's not the best that we can do, as in this makes the system vulnerable. If, for example, many large token holders, aka whales, are dormant, a few can then rule the show, and this is something that has been observed in Polkadot and other ecosystems here and there. In general, one token, one vote has the good property that it embodies skin in the game really well, but it doesn't necessarily embodies a fair representation, because if someone has more skin in the game, let's give them more voice. That's good from some perspective, but also not in all cases. Actually, now we're doing this recording right after the Web3 Summit, and we had a keynote from Gavin Wood, the founder of Polkadot, speaking about some new projects regarding personhood, and the idea of establishing really a concrete notion of individuality on blockchains, including Polkadot. And I think this is also a key solution to governance. It would take some time for it to still be implemented and seen in action, but I'm similarly very excited to see Polkadot pioneering the way here, as in, let's build privacy-friendly, resilient individuality mechanisms, and this would take a long time in itself. But once this mechanism is in place, let's now build a whole new governance structure on top of it. It's not necessarily one token, one vote. It could be possibly one person, one vote, or a mix of two, or a spectrum. Like on certain decisions, we might want to give more voice to those who hold more tokens because it's perhaps more reasonable. But on certain other decisions, we might want to give a fair representation of one person, one vote. So all of these things would be possible with Polkadot's futuristic individuality projects that could be integrated into governance and would solve the problem of being stuck with one person, one vote.
When it comes to the legal and regulatory framework for DAOs, I think there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of uncertainty. Again, it depends exactly on what do we mean with the legal and regulatory framework for DAOs. There's a question of, can DAOs interact with normal entities? Like, can a DAO have a contract with a school? Or can a DAO have a contract with a hospital, a big company? Can a DAO buy real estate, in the physical world? All of those things. And would a DAO for that not lead some sort of legal personhood or legal entity, also again incorporated in traditional jurisdiction? So there's a question then of legal personhood and entities and entering into contracts and real world assets. That's one field of legal questions. There's a big field that came up tremendously with the Tornado Cash case, which we briefly mentioned in the lectures as well. It's all about the liability protection. So if something goes wrong or a DAO conducts criminal activities, who is to be held liable? Usually, if we have a normal legal company, there is some sort of protection of the investors, right? But in the case of a DAO, if it is not incorporated, there might be cases where any token holder has unlimited liability. So questions of liability are a big one. There's questions of the fact that DAOs often issue tokens, so just the regulatory gray zones around tokens themselves, with or without DAOs, is a question of securities regulation. And I mean, there's so many more fields that we could discuss here. And all this is just to say that where do we stand in terms of regulatory requirements? In my opinion, we still have a long way to go, but I tend to hang out with a lot of lawyers and legal scholars, and I'm told these are fascinating questions, really, and could fundamentally also instigate new approaches to legal regulation in the field of online organization. So when it comes to the challenges that DAOs face, I think there's not a lack of options to choose from. I want to maybe point to two. One of them we touched on also in the lectures, which is the issue of token-based voting, which just means that the more tokens you hold, the more voting power you have in the DAO, which obviously leads to some plutocratic dynamics. We've seen occasions where it's very, very few people that hold more than 50% of tokens and can thereby really drive decisions in their sort of favor. So that's something that is quite problematic, especially in an ecosystem where we sort of want to value decentralization, where we want to make powerful stakeholders more accountable than they are in the traditional digital economy. So experimenting with different voting dynamics, I think, is really key here to improve governance dynamics in DAOs as a whole. I think there's a lot that we can choose from, and just sticking with tokens was maybe the obvious thing in the crypto world because that's one of the major innovations, of course. But yeah, so this is a big challenge, and I'm curious to see different styles of voting sort of emerging over the next few months and years. Another problem that is really important, in my opinion, to talk about, and maybe less nice to discuss because there's less economic and game theory and technical things that we can engineer, is simply the fact that we're seeing voter apathy or just DAO participation apathy and fatigue sort of happening. And this is the fact that DAOs are becoming confronted with this harsh reality of, on the one hand, presenting users and participants with this gift of like, hey, we invite you to be involved, we invite you to have a say and to participate in the governance of this project. And then on the other side, the reality that many people are busy, we have limited attention spans, we may not care that much about what this project that we are part of alongside 10 other projects is trying to achieve. So yeah, sort of balancing out the invitation to anybody and everybody to come and participate and take a stake in an ecosystem, while also knowing that for things to evolve smoothly and efficiently, we need some people who are more full-time dedicated to keeping up with discussions in the forum, to really becoming informed on issues, etc. And finding this sweet spot, I think, is also going to be a key challenge to overcome in the next years and months in order to keep DAOs sustainable. And I'm curious to see how initiatives like professionalizing delegates and paying them